you, Ellis, for those words, and thank you all for coming. A daunting prospect, I think, nowadays, having sharing a space like this with 800 other people, so thank you. I think from the beginning, we've been, as a practice, less interested in the individual and more in the collective. And it's this idea of practice as a collective endeavour that I'm going to talk about this evening. As Ellis has already mentioned, 3 studios actually, and I think this idea of collective endeavour is really evident in those 3 studios. 3 working with a sense of collective endeavour, a combination of sort of independence and interdependence, each with their own specific character, yet an underlying sense of like-mindedness. This notion of collective endeavour relies upon a shared understanding of a way of working, establishing a common ground, if you like, upon which we can all work, establishing through dialogue a shared understanding of a culture, our preoccupations and inspirations that motivate us all. Our exhibition 5 Rooms, which was held at the House of Art in the Czech Republic, charted 5 different areas of practice. The first room, facing the city, thinking about the way that buildings engage with their urban context. The second, the spatial plan, thinking about the atmospheres and characters of the spaces we make. Alongside these 2 were 3 further rooms. One, a library housing the writing output from the office. Teaching, both of these critical to our form of practice. And a 5th room devoted to reference. The sharing of points of reference has proven critical, helping shape the common dialogue in the studio, be it the way light falls down a staircase or the visual density of an explicit timber construction. So 5 rooms dedicated to looking at ways of integrating research into a form of practice. The concept for the exhibition allowed it to travel to 2 further locations in Switzerland, Kriens and Lausanne. The former, a beautiful old house in a garden, and in the latter, a large space where we created a room within a room. The curators of this exhibition took the work into the city as a public display in the form of posters, bringing the work to an audience that might otherwise not have ever seen it. This aspect of like-mindedness extends beyond those we work with day to day, to those we seek out outside the practice. We forge relationships with, often over many years. This privilege of working with people with whom one finds common ground, we think is to be nurtured. One such relationship we've been forging for almost all of the 25 years that Ellis mentioned is that with Ruth, and in particular Mark Horn. We first met over our project in Shepherdess Walk, a project to make a kind of community townhouse. Almost immediately it became clear we shared a passion for pragmatic yet innovative construction ideas, unafraid of investigations into techniques and materials such as prefabricated timber frame, which back then was still relatively untested, and breathing wall technology. 15 years later, we won a competition together to convert a Grade 2 listed brewery in East London into an international business school. We recognised the need to unlock the spatial sequence of the existing building by inserting a new stair, and so together with Price and Myers, we worked with Ruth on developing inventive, careful solutions to construct a plastic spatial object slotted into this tight urban site. The resulting generous staircase clad in Douglas fir timber with oversized landings provides opportunities for chance encounters within the day-to-day life of the building. Right now, we're working on a house together, the house that positions itself to hold the parcel of the site and take advantage of the views to the east over neighbouring Epping Forest and to the west over the adjacent open agricultural land. It's a project that seeks to invite the landscape to invade the site in a way. It also seeks to avoid domestication of that landscape by establishing a courtyard garden, a kind of counterweight to the house, the biggest room in the ensemble of rooms. The house itself is assembled from a series of volumes laid out and stacked around a stable core, which organises the house, while a series of appendages respond to the day-to-day life of the home. An entrance loggia for arrival in muddy boots, a bay window to allow the occupant to step away from the main space. And at the heart of the house is a hall, a space that accommodates the domestic daily activities of the family. It's a space that's imbued with the atmosphere of construction, giving scale and material presence. Together, we're talking about how the shell of this house in a landscape might be more primal, but at the same time intelligent, a massive wall of brick and low-fired terracotta working together in a kind of homogeneous whole. Another such long-lasting relationship is that with Bay-like properties, particularly Crispin Kelly, a project which started actually the same year as Shepherdess Walk, exploring different ways of living in the city, of making homes with rich and spatial thresholds to the domestic realm. The project took some existing workshop buildings and built on and around, overlaying and densifying programme in a way that made a vibrant new community. You can just see the project was next to a river, the River Wandle, and it left a small slither of land between the two. And sited on this small slither, we developed a project that once again looked at questioning models for living within a dense urban setting. We sought to engage with the Wandle Trail, a 20-kilometre walking and cycle route, which we extended through the site, tying it into this wider green network. And a pencil tower is positioned over the route, anchoring itself to the existing buildings, the river edge, and the wider network. Its faceted form adjusts through subtle steps and twists as it rises past the existing context onto the skyline. The tower is robust, materials of washed concrete and a coarse brick tumbled in line set the building in dialogue with its host site. And within this chiselled form, a collection of compact floor plans which respond to the gentle swellings and adjustments afforded by the external form. Balconies move around the plan as the building rises, adjusting to the shifting geometry and exploiting the changing aspect and orientation. On the lower levels, studio workshops engage with the new-made public ground. It's a project that learns as much from London's fabric imbued with history and folklore, like the Canonbury Tower here on the left, as it does Codex Casa de la Marina, with its faceted plan setting up complex relationships and kaleidoscopic spatial qualities. I think such a project can only be born of a long-lasting and engaged dialogue between us and the client, Crispin, each challenging the other to be ever more inventive and ever more brave. Our project for the Ruthin Craft Centre was another born from a client with vision and insight. Working with the two directors, they brought their understanding of the nature of craft to the discussions, and the plastic expressive roof form came about for sure through their encouragement to be as bold as we dared. So too the vibrant pigmenting of the concrete walls, rhyming with the local red sandstone, but sharing an attitude to oxides and pigments inherited from ceramic making. We were introduced to a language of textiles, of materials draped and folded that resonated with the undulating and textured zinc surfaces we were making, and of threads and corduroy that bring a kind of visual density to the surface and seem to exaggerate its form. And it was a shared discussion around all of these qualities that led to the idea of mark making on the concrete surface, like monochromatic sgraffito, research had already led us to this idea of tilt-up construction, where, as you can see here, wall panels cast on the ground, then tilted up, a sort of locally sourced precast yard. And it led us to another exploration of this like-mindedness, of working with and learning from the people who actually make our projects, who pour the concrete, who crimp the metal, who join the timber. Together with this man that you see here, Jonathan Harrison, we developed tools and techniques so that the hand of the maker really is evident in the face of the building. Once complete, this textured surface at high level catches the light and patinates with the Welsh weather. Then, like a kind of inverse dado, it gives way to a smoother surface lower down, making a more comfortable place to occupy. So, when we developed this project, a tower house sitting within the Portsmouth estate in Hampshire, we did so with all of the lessons learned from Ruthin in our mind. It hovers somewhere between a kind of memory of the water tower on the footprint of which it sits, and a medieval folly or lodge that commands views over the estate and the wider landscape. At once a place of prospect and retreat, we developed a spatial plan, a bit difficult to see, sorry, developed a spatial plan around a strategy of carving out space from a solid whole, a whole that grows out from the ground around it, a ground that's rich with flint, a ground that's been in the ownership of the estate for 500 years. So when it came to thinking about how to make a monolithic, highly insulated, steadfast building that could take its place alongside this kind of lineage, we got back in contact with Jonathan Harrison, which sounds kind of trite, but together we explored ways of gathering the flint field stones and incorporating them into the strata of the lime-rich concrete to give the building a kind of geological quality befitting, we felt, of its place in the world. I've spoken about the notion of shared endeavour, of generating a sense of like-mindedness with those we work with. And perhaps the most tangible versions of this are in the many collaborations we've undertaken. Collaborating with others who bring their own expertise and experience involves trust and open-mindedness. And it brings the possibility to work in ways on projects that are perhaps otherwise outside of one's normal realm, be that scale, geography, or technology. Working with Stephen Taylor Architects, Alison Morrison and Jonathan Cook, we worked on proposals for a new urban quarter in Harrow, a scale that in a way only felt possible through that collaboration. We understood it as a quarter because within its context we felt it important it could be identified as having a certain determined character through a material palette as well as building organisation. Within our plans, we explored how within the usual efficiencies imposed on the scheme, we could make inventive and volumetrically rich apartments, and how through the shaping of the communal parts, one might break down the areas outside the home. We talked about them as a sequence of chambers. Elsewhere, with McCrane Lavington, Howarth Tompkins, East and Architecture Doing Place, we're working on the Aylesbury Estate regeneration, a kind of huge, vast, challenging project that seeks to provide new homes for the existing 7,500 residents. Our contribution, a small part, is one part of a courtyard that proposes a kind of robust brick framework, varied and tolerant in its proportioning, and made of warm terracotta-coloured brickwork. And etched into this background is what we've called a wainscot of light brick, loose in its form and adjusting in height in response to the proportion and aspect and context. I mentioned scale, but so too geography. Over the last 25 years, we found the opportunity to make projects in many parts of Europe and occasionally further afield. We found, however, particular affinity with Belgium, Flanders and Brussels more so. Particularly, I think thanks in parts, of course, to their enlightened open OPRUP system. But we find ourselves often in a kind of dual condition. On the one hand, there's an unmistakable cultural affinity. On the other, we're outsiders, seeing things differently, sometimes simplistically perhaps, but I think always for what they are. At our project for the Tour and Taxis site in Brussels, we worked together with noArchitecten and AVG to make a master plan on the periphery of the city centre for a site that was the old terminus and shunting yard for freight coming into the city. The site stretches from the urban edge at the south to a new green space at the north. And our master plan seeks to make a kind of legible piece of the city that draws these two conditions together. A key element is the Dreef, a 275-metre long undulating terrace of buildings that faces the old station shed, the Gare Maritime, holding a planted space between the two. It looked carefully at the interwar architecture of Brussels, influenced by the Anglo-American Art Deco movement. Buildings are characterised by vibrant red-orange brickwork with dense and inventive detailing and faceted bay forms that bring a kind of sculptural quality to the buildings. But the Dreef is as equally influenced by the grand terraces of London, urban set pieces that accommodate subtle, specific differences within a coherent whole. At the head of the Dreef, where it engages with the city edge, sits one of the 8 buildings that we're designing. The tightly folded facade and generous window proportion gives the building, I think, an almost kind of skeletal quality, where the bones are made from a red-pink brick set amid a lime-coloured mortar, whilst corbelled brickwork creates heavily toothed lintels, crowns and rusticated bases. In these buildings, the communal entrance seems possibly the most important moment that one can think of, the moment that every single resident and visitor will experience, and a chance to break free of the cellular arrangement elsewhere. A special shaped precast column allows the building to open itself up, whilst richly coloured tiling and chunky wooden framing gives this, a building containing exclusively affordable homes, gives it an appropriate sense of quality and decorum. Set in this planted space between the Dreef and the Gare Maritime are 5 buildings, multi-directional solitaires, that are positioned in a kind of syncopated arrangement from south to north, each with its own form and character. This one of the 2 that we're making, consists of a muscular frame of brick and gently shaped precast pieces, which wrap around the building's 12 facets. The brick-lined, tiled entrance hall accommodates a few key elements: a precast stair, a spatial light fitting, and, yet to be installed, a hanging tapestry. Our second solitaire occupies a kind of privileged position, sitting at the very northern end of the site and overlooking the adjacent park, affording the building both prospect and aspect. A frame of scalloped precast concrete pieces give the building a kind of delicate scale, whilst softened and embellished metalwork gives one the sense it's easing and accommodating. 4 years ago, we won this project in collaboration with 360 Architecten and Bates to convert an old 19th century military barracks into a kind of plethora of programs: a hotel, an art school, a creche, housing, and the new offices for the East Flanders provincial government. Together with 360, we've wrestled the sometimes overbearing fabric of these old military buildings into a complex and varied set of spaces, comprising offices, classrooms, meeting rooms, council chamber, exhibition spaces. Spaces for the public to ask questions of their governing authority. The found spaces of the existing building are harnessed, finishes stripped back to give a palpable material presence to the rooms, whilst new spaces are made around and on top of the existing buildings to accommodate additional programme. These spaces are made with the same kind of attitude, that of direct and evident construction, and they're lined with materials that seek an equivalence with the existing through their tone, texture, and application. More recently, collaboration has given us the opportunity to work in and around Paris with two projects that hopefully will start construction this year. Saint-Vincent-de-Paul was an old walled hospital in the 14th arrondissement of Paris. Once the hospital closed 10 years ago, the site became kind of colonised with meanwhile uses and socially diverse activities. The existing master plan drawn up for the development of the site proposed a series of closed courtyards, but to us this seemed to go against this kind of open, permeable quality that the site had rather organically taken on. Working with Beaubois et Grandorge, we sought to challenge the master plan, perhaps something that's always easier as an outsider. And we proposed an open urban structure of 3 buildings linked together with open portico structures. In this way, the retained existing building, seen here in the bottom right, is brought into the ensemble and nestles among the Morandi-like loose composition of forms. 4 years ago, the Parisian architect Lambert Lenac made a master plan for a project on the edge of the gardens of the Palace of Versailles, an extraordinary location and an extraordinary privilege. We were invited to make a series of apartment buildings set within a garden at the heart of the scheme. Contrary to the master plan, we were interested in the kind of picturesque possibilities of the site. Garden pavilions that are somehow familiar to each other, yet individual in their precise dimension and arrangement. Following the tradition of lodges on the estate, we proposed faceted forms that are ambiguous in their orientation, but provide for 2 distinct characters of facade, one closed, the other open, allowing the apartment to embrace the garden landscape, making spaces for living along the facade in a really direct way. So the final type of collaboration I mentioned was that of a sort of technological collaboration, working with specialists, sometimes on the fringes of architecture perhaps, who can bring unexpected ways of looking at things and enriching a project, transform it even. Sometime after completing the business school I showed earlier, the same client, in fact, who'd moved on, gave us the opportunity to compete for the refurbishment of the Grade 2 listed Peter James building. Our instinct was to look carefully at what was there, but also how it came to be. And we began to understand the store for what it is, an urban block rather than a single building, composed of pieces added to the 19th century fabric over time, each of their own period, spanning from 1932 to 65. Our proposal was to give legitimacy and legibility back to this composition, approaching each part in a subtly different but necessary way, adding a new entrance of bronze doors and tile-lined lobby, adding a new canopy of coarse render and lighting. Working with Purcell, we sought an equivalence of attitude between our new elements and the original fabric, which sat somewhere between English arts and crafts and European modernism. The things we look to add aren't slick or retail in their character, more coarse, more material, more clearly put together. Perhaps the most demonstrable of this attitude is the work we undertook to the upper levels of the building. We worked with iArt from Switzerland and sought to capture something of the original spirit of the building, that of an ever-changing animated facade with opening windows, painted spandrels, shown here in an old AJ article. Today, these qualities are being lost. Together with iArt, we developed new spandrel panels that could adapt and change. Using a simple motorized slatted blind, the panel can change in its appearance. Each panel's interconnected and then controlled by weather patterns. And so the building becomes a kind of organic barometer, breathing in and out throughout the day. More dramatic at night, as lights are added into the panels and bring the opportunity for colour. At the start of 2019, we won a competition to design a performing arts centre for the city of Leuven in Flanders. It's a complex project requiring careful steps, bringing a new public building accommodating intense activity and upwards of 2,000 people right into the heart of the city centre with its dense and historic buildings and proud citizens. It's also technologically complex. From the beginning, we've been working with Charcoal Blue, who bring their extensive and intensive expertise to the dialogue, helping shape the project and meet the spatial and technical demands. But first and foremost, it's a complex project, I think, because it asks us to speculate on what a house for the performing arts in the future might be. Our idea was to make an open house. We thought of the short-lived but seminal food restaurant in New York, where cooking and eating was seen as performance art, celebrating and elevating everyday activity. And we thought of Teatro Oficina in Sao Paulo, a raw, non-precious space where, through the vertiginous arrangement of galleries, performance is understood as a collective activity, where the boundary is blurred between performer and audience. And this open house, this challenging building, sits alongside some of the most highly protected historic buildings in Leuven. A 13th century monastery once occupied the site. And we seek to make a project that resonates with this historic fabric, finds a kind of spatial and formal equivalence. We make a project that's embedded in the city, stitched into the historic fabric, that joins in with it to make a new whole, unlocking the existing spaces whilst making new ones. The courtyard between the two becomes charged with possibilities and echoes with the network of courtyards prevalent in the city. The new building is comprised of a fluid set of spaces, challenging conventional arrangements of lobby, foyer, circulation and theatre hall. Instead, we make spaces that have the capacity to be used in different ways and that have a very direct relationship to the adjacent street and courtyard. The building opens itself up and invites the passerby in. Through its spatial arrangement, but so too through its facade, which is somehow extremely familiar in its form and organisation, rhyming with the adjoining monastic buildings, and deeply familiar within the Flemish tradition, but made in a way that challenges this familiarity. A curtain wall of steel windows and textured glass hovers above a mobile and active ground. It's a facade that's open and communicative of the activity that lies within. Facing the street on the ground floor, we place the live room, that's what we call it, a public living room that enables appropriation and improvisation. We make a space where the acts of eating, drinking, watching, performing can overlay and overlap. It's ambiguous in its character, radical in its material properties, and adaptable in its spatial form. Around the corner in the courtyard, we make a place for activity and performance. There's an open and generous connection to the glazed spaces alongside, where carefully positioned openings allow for an exchange. The most significant of these is the Jardin d'Hiver, 65 metres long, stretching the full depth of the building, connecting all of its parts and acting as a threshold, circulation, performance venue, and breakout space. It's a space shaped by a multi-layered and visually complex arrangement of structure and linings that, through colour, are brought into a kind of coherent whole. The rooms that the Jardin d'Hiver connects are diverse and varied, a large performance hall, flexible in its possibilities of arrangement from proscenium dance to flat floor circus. A second performance hall at first floor with a window to the street, a piano nobile from which to engage with the city. Rooms in the roof for rehearsal, festival, digital art. It's a building dense with possibilities and full of a technical invention. It's a building where the act of construction moulds the character of the spaces housed within, where the hard-working nature of the infrastructure imbues the spaces with a quality of expectant activity. There was something of a sense of a beautiful, hard-working building when we first saw the Citroën factory in Brussels. Working together with noArchitecten again and EM2N, we set about making the new Kanal project. But as part of that collaboration, we've also worked with critical friends, theatre makers, artists, curators, who bring important questions and challenges, and who, through their insight and input, help us make a radical and potent project.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everyone. Thanks also to Ellis for the invitation to share some preoccupations and projects with all of you this evening. Trusting in what is there, that was the mantra that we gave ourselves looking at this conversion of the Yser Citroën car factory and showroom in central Brussels, the capital of Europe. It was a rather easy thing to do as we first encountered this extraordinary building, the size of a city block of 40,000 square metres, 2 football pitches, with its cloud-like roof of filigree steel and glass, all made at the size of the human hand and body. An expansive space. But there was a kind of stillness evident and a strong sense of the echoes of the past. Indeed, Anna Wiebroek, one of our critical friends, the great set designer from Dusseldorf, quoted John Hedghook when she said in reaction to her first walk around, "The house never forgets the sound of its original occupants." It's a very beautiful thing that stayed with us. But it was also quite clear that this building wasn't fit for the purpose of an international art museum. The project, and indeed the competition, really prompted this question: what is the role and indeed the identity of a public building today? Perhaps, we thought, it is programmatically open, physically open, an invitation to use, a place of production, a place of usefulness. And we set our focus really on creating not only an internationally significant exhibition space, but to repurpose the Citroën garage as a resource for local people. The plan reveals the inherent organisation that already existed of what we call nave, and street. It became fundamental in organising the idea of the connection of spaces, both within the building and to the city beyond. To give you an idea of scale, the nave is 180 metres long compared to the Tate Modern turbine hall, which is 155. From that, car ramps from here and here rise to a raised platform, a vast public space under the majestic roof, within which are located the rooms and the galleries, the platforms, the clearings. We saw it as a kind of agora, a common ground for people to meet and to pause, to encounter art, to experience staged and spontaneous performances. The project isn't a museum in the strictest sense. It's more like a stage, or multiple stages. It has an exciting simultaneity, views between things and spaces, reinforce the museum as a single organism. But there's a special acoustic. Many things are going on at once. And most importantly, it is a place unfinished. With the echoes and scars of the past and past lives, we started by mapping every detail of the existing structure, recording the layers of paint, the layers of dust and damage, all accumulated over the years. And many of the existing elements will remain visible, remain useful. But we also needed to reimagine existing spaces, like the iconic showroom that you can see on the left. A space that has no program, we thought, that could open up to form part of the public square outside, or be contained to be a major public room for events, overlooked by the Friends Room, public landings, and the restaurant. We also needed to work out how to add new constructed volumes and surfaces, and 3 new objects, like big houses containing the rooms and galleries, one dedicated to modern and contemporary art, the other to the architecture museum and archive, and the third as a sort of cultural centre, provide the necessary high-performance, environmentally controlled spaces. The galleries become a kind of repertoire of different character. The garage and the showroom, the ancillary spaces between, become a vast container of rooms and spaces, some refined, others raw, some enclosed, others open to the flow of visitors. Small and large scale, a space you can get lost in, a space that you can enter anonymously. The volumes emerge through the existing garage as semi-transparent and cloud-like. And this is a one-to-one mock-up that shows the layers of the construction of these new volumes as they appear on the roofline. Their construction visibly evident, the cladding of prima sola ribbed glass, visibly clamped to a framework, a galvanized framework using standard shelf angles and T-profiles. There's nothing about manufactured production here. It's a multi-layered facade that feels like it's made by hands. It has the fallibility of such. It creates different lighting conditions, or it responds to the different lighting conditions, and indeed mediates with the nearby financial city buildings. So this attitude to everything new having a kind of equivalence to the existing, but built together in a matter-of-fact way, open to curation. This sense of equivalence of the new and the nearly new, the old and the very old, is something that recurs, I think, in our conversations. While we were working on the Museum of London competition, our collaborator, Roger Dina, introduced us to this painting, The Fate of the Animals. It's a painting that was completed in 1913 and was damaged by a warehouse fire. Franz Marc, the creator of the painting, had died in the war, but his friend Paul Klee in 1916 restored the painting, agreed to restore it. And he did so in a very honest and direct way by, you can see this right-hand edge. He completed it faithfully, but added a brownish tint over the area of his own repainting. In so doing, he completed the picture, but he also transformed it and revealed a new and further layer. I think it sums up our attitude to restoration and transformation, perhaps a bit contrary to the dictum, the modernist dictums of the Venice Charter. The idea, instead of a continuity of layers, an understanding of the many layers of history and time. It resonates, I think, with an earlier project that we made for our dear friends Ian Cartledge and Adam Levine here in London, in St John Street, a studio building, where we made cuts into the existing fabric that spatially connect, certainly, of course, following the formal rigor of US artists of the 60s and 70s, like Matta Clark and Dan Graham and Dan Flavin. But these cuts radically transform the ordinary to make new connections to place and ideas. The expression of layers needed to be established at the scale of the hand, close up. And so we drew one-to-one hand drawings to fix those dimensions. The layers of Douglas fir, of white plaster, of galvanized edge beads, of mirror, of wired glass, all rather banal things that come together in a highly composed and integrated whole with what existed already. It's sobering to know that we use more resources each year than our planet can regenerate. 1.75 Earths are needed to support current demands on the ecosystem. The so-called World Overshoot Day was July the 29th last year. That's 7 months in excess of what we really are able to regenerate. It's quite clear that the linear economy is no longer sustainable. The take, make, use, waste economy needs to be replaced with a circular approach. We need to think differently. We need to think of buildings as material banks. We need to think about how we dismantle buildings that we design before we've built them. We need to think about recycling. We need to start designing much more consciously. And in some aspects, this is not so new to us. The idea of passive, low energy, appropriate construction, in a way forms a kind of bedrock to how we think. But so too has the intention to integrate with those ideas social and cultural concerns. I think the idea that architecture takes hold of the sustainable agenda is so important. In 1998, the Labour government was rethinking and reinventing how the construction industry worked. John Prescott's construction task force addressed ideas of wastefulness. Some of you won't know what I'm talking about, others will. Lord Egan's report, Rethinking Construction, was well-meaning. It promoted renewed working methods like partnering. It was a time of welfare to work, New Deal for communities. It was top-down government, encouraging housing associations and contractors to innovate and to experiment. And with ROOF, together with the Community Self-Build Association, the New Essex Housing Association, we were part of that endeavour, here combining assisted self-build and prefabricated timber panel construction. And as Mark said, in those days, we only knew one timber panel contractor. It was always a bit of a problem to get a competitive tender. Now we see a more Now, we see a more bottom-up approach, and an innovative and engaged government is nowhere to be seen. Around this time, we were realizing we spent all our time in troubled estates rather than designing museums in historic centres like some of our friends. And that changed as we ventured to the continent for work, as in Belgium. The city library in Blankenberge became a project of urban repair and adaptive reuse of an old friend of the community, a school building close to the seafront, on line with the railway station. So known. We connected it back to the street by adding adjacent street buildings, which were recessive. This is one of them here, and there's another one here. Both results of bomb damage, because aeroplanes would drop their bomb loads having left Ostend, and poor Blankenberge became a victim of a lot of bombing. The front facade was protected, but the structure of the building wasn't. It seems that we were the only people in the competition who kept both, and by adding a new layer, a new facade at the back that accommodated circulation and means of escape requirements, we could retain the formal structure of an enfilade of rooms. So we treated the ruinous structure as a noble shell, enjoying the tall rooms, the linking halls, the cool light, a kind of calm order, a kind of condition that you can't justify designing fresh, but you can justify retaining it. But then we installed the library as a transitional occupation. So as we progress and project our thoughts forward in this very real emergency, we need to update our thinking. We need to find our own interpretations and objectives within the low energy, zero waste debate. And the office research that we carried out just before the first lockdown, from November 19 to February 20th, we posed 10 questions to ourselves. The research workshop was called Towards Intelligent Building, Towards Intelligent Practice. And while it reconfirmed to us that building is a process of interaction and is deeply social, it also showed that reuse is a primary direction for us. But it also showed that each project requires a specific discussion about the strategy to take. We're a bit concerned about the tendency to oversimplify the sustainability agenda. And while the current trend is towards a strictly low-carbon strategy, towards low-embodied energy like timber construction, we want to be part of the evolving debate about what else. You see, different countries have very different and varying codes and regulations and trends and politicians. Hamburg, for example, currently has no existing assessment criteria for the use of timber construction in the city. So even if you want to use it, there's no way of getting permission to do so. So we've realized that we have this integration, this involvement of work in different countries requires time to learn of the various cultural restraints and opportunities. It's very important for us as a practice where 70 to 75% of our work is in mainland Europe. We made this competition 2 years ago in Hamburg, which we didn't win. But we did recently win this project in Munkenbergerstraße, together with old friends Brethmeyer Schleich, architects from Cologne. Hamburg is a city of facades. It's a city of Fritz Höger, Franz Bach. It's a city of the urban plan of Fritz Schumacher. It's a city of the Speicherstadt, a powerful Hanseatic tradition of thick brick buildings. The client is dedicated towards a sustainable model, a flagship for their business, the site itself central within the city. And we're exploring circularity with 50% renewables, exploiting hybrid construction, and designing the building for a use well beyond its current one. And there's this big and interesting debate with our sustainability consultants over the idea of permanence. Our point being that the facade should be built to last. It isn't really fitting into the circularity story so much, we believe. It has a strong form at a primary scale, these powerful gables that fit to the street, that make it an appropriate neighbour to some majestic buildings. It is, in a way, an appropriate face to the city. And at the same time, it's seeking to find a new interpretation of this Hanseatic tradition. The facade of self-supporting brick is an armature, but one that is delicate and fine. It's built to last. But by removing almost the middle scale, there is instead an amazing detail at third scale, the scale of the hand. This gives a textural complexity. It's not so interested in tectonics. It is about durability and longevity. Mosque and cathedral in Cordoba is a building of multiple lives. It's constructed of found pieces, 856 columns. I know that because my students in Munich made this drawing and they remarked on the number of columns. It's been modified and modified again. It has an enduring presence. Indeed, this, keeps pressing the wrong thing. This first phase, the columns are almost completely recycled from a Roman settlement. But it becomes enduring and powerful due to its innate structure and proportion. Recurring theme that has been with us, this interest in strong objects, the physical quality of the object and the space between it. This is our Novartis building in Shanghai. So we're interested that things have last a long time. We're interested in the idea of durability. I found this out from Mark, so I'm cribbing from Mark, but the French and Dutch words for sustainability both relate to durability. The Dutch, duurzaamheid, is that okay, Kirsten? And durability. And we've adopted the expression intelligent ruin in our thinking, first coined by Bob van Rieth, the first Flemish bouwmeester, who considered buildings as a series of temporal layers, a figurative structure, building for an unknown future in which durability and craft are the base. The notion of building and designing a structure consciously to last for several centuries. These are themes that I've been working on with students at the TU Munich as part of my professorship at the Chair of Urbanism and Housing, undertaken with Bruno Krukke. We're encouraging students to look at inherent structure. This is King's College Chapel in Cambridge. The model is of the raw structure, the ruin. And while all the layers are drawn, the piers, the fan vaults, the traceries, the wooden screen, the tiles, it actually encourages a concentration of the students upon the proportion of structure. These students who made this study went on to make this project here that explores this notion of an inherent structure that is intended to last beyond the many first and second lives of itself. This comes from the semester entitled Towards the Intelligent Ruin, and in a further semester, Transformational Buildings. infrastructures are designed with a consciousness to their own future beyond their initial use, and to the future nature of the city, now and in 20 years. I'm sure all of you know this young lady here with her pink handbag. She's well-travelled, appears in pretty much every architectural competition that I've ever seen. Nice sort of wit of the students who made the proposal here, and when asked by myself to speculate on the future of the city 20 to 50 years' time, where the railway has become something else and big buildings are getting bigger. We're interested in this strong figure, this urban form, resilient but not absolute, faintly ambiguous. A resilient structure. I think it's evident in our plan for Citygate in Brussels, which is a current project we're making together with noA. It's a bit familiar, this, isn't it? noA, good friends, KSA, Contextual, Schoolmaker, and AHA. Citygate forms part of the Kanal plan, the Bouwmeester's wonderful Kanal plan. You know, his mantra, a good city needs industry, is one that we support highly, this encouragement for the return of production to the centre of the city. This is one of many drawings that he uses to talk about it, and here you can see, you can't see, but I'm telling you anyway, this is Touring Taxis here, and the Kanal project is here, and this is the site in Beesterbroek, in Anderlecht, of the Citygate site. Our strategy was termed, we described it as the assembled city. It was a loose fit approach determined by almost archaeology, you know, the alignment of existing buildings and the boundary conditions. Connections and spaces between are more incidental. There's a kind of tolerance, a breathing possible to deal with the vagaries of time, the vagaries of circumstance, of changing brief over a number of year period. The buildings are treated as infrastructures alongside reused existing buildings, a new school, workshops, and the car park underneath, creating a kind of bedrock infrastructure that's designed already anticipating a use for the future. We're responsible for 5 buildings, including the big car park infrastructure. And the project was recently selected as a pilot project for FCABE, which is facilitating the circulation of reclaimed building elements in northwestern Europe. So we're investigating that as we start designing the buildings now with Rotor, and emphasizing, or with an emphasis towards a continuity from cradle to cradle. The Citygate is a sort of part of a piece of city, 400 social and affordable homes, a light industrial use. It's sort of intimate, it's intense, it's full of interlinked spaces. And we're interested in this open character, this material presence that Mark referred to. And while we are London architects, we find it quite comfortable to slip into another culture, to influence the situation, to watch from the edge, to work at the margins. But it seems also to show itself at home, this otherness. In a recent Architecture Today article, Patrick Lynch, who wrote this nice piece, describes the project as absolutely embedded in its situation and place, and also somewhat uncanny and other. I think it's interesting that our character, the forming of our thoughts and approach at the edges looking in is really permeating all our work. From this almost invisible edge through a gate, you find the project, a building, a set of buildings within an urban block, requires some effort to find. And when you find it, you find 9 dwellings around a garden, a kind of refuge. It is, in the end, a resilient structure which forms part of the experience of the day-to-day, organised through courtyard apartments. It's robust and deeply domestic, reminiscent perhaps of living in a building with a past use, somewhere between an industrial building and a béguinage, and the Mews facade like a small castle. The chamfered corners give it a softness, and the rhythm of pilasters give it a sameness. Sameness is an idea about repetition. Nature shows us that replicas are never identical, but rather a repertoire of subtle differences with regard to a given type. We see this as a strategic concept. It's experiential. And I've learned over many years from the Georgian street, the hints of the picturesque that we engage with instinctively. The challenge of making a large residential care home the largest structure in the town, in a small rural town in Flanders, was a big challenge to find an answer that could feel like home to individual residents. And we developed an idea for the windows with tiled curtains and worked together with the artist Benoit van Innis. And he developed 50 motifs reacting to the 4 orientations of the building, each which had 5 different facades. And by varying the colour with a 10 by 10 tile, monastic work, he said, as he painted each one of 45,000 tiles. Each window, each curtain is different, it's unique. It represents each of the individuals of each of the 145 rooms. You can feel the hand-painted quality. It is in the end a matte building, defined by a repeated linear roof pitch arrangement, but by making cuts around the outer edges and inside to form courtyards, but those cuts misaligned to the pitch. The consequence of subtle distortion gives a coincidental quality, a kind of sameness. The building reveals itself as a series of episodes, small-scale encounters, familiar forms to the memory of the residents from Bruges and Ghent generally. And recently completed the Harbour Building in Antwerp, we designed as part of an urban block together with 2 local practices, Bovenbouw and Bulk. We were responsible for the Harbour Building you can see on the picture here, an 86-metre facade, and it emerged as an exploration of the bay. The character was really intended to lie somewhere between a warehouse and a mansion block, coarse but also refined, and you probably can't see from here, but there is a discernible ordering, the base, middle and top, defined by window opening proportions and brick bonds. But there's an inherent looseness in the rhythm, with the bays having 2 different projections, each reacting to the varied party wall lines of the apartments within, and the supporting arches being of 2 heights, like shop awnings projecting over the street. This syncopated, offbeat rhythm devised from the real conditions of party walls, but also allowing to give a controlled disturbance, somehow feeling perfectly imperfect. It is a study of sameness, but reveals an instinctive resistance to making absolute objects. Instead, to allow a more organic process, open to the forces of play on a site, allowing circumstance and tolerance to influence them. And inside, within the bay, the loggia and the nook, found via an open passageway with a ceiling of encaustic tiles, which you can't really see here, specially designed and now dedicated to our client, Hans Gersens, who sadly died before the project was finally handed over. Onward to the special studio apartments, special in height and shape, with their direct relation to the garden. It is a domestic interior, one that's been at the heart of our thinking from the start and remains an important field of investigation. we've always seen the relevance of past ideas on domesticity, feeling that they can inform a way of progressing domestic space as the future. This charming image of Jacobus Frel, tall and narrow domestic interior with a box bed on the right, spare and attenuated interior space. An almost single all-purpose room that form the centre of domestic life. We're really drawn to this aspect of rooms and a society of rooms, or a suite of rooms, which enables a more generic or contingent planning rather than a directly functional or specific approach. And in our Fitzjohn's Avenue project, commissioned by Pegasus Life, a specialist developer interested in providing alternative living options for older residents over 60. There was this idea of making private worlds for the elderly residents, ones that were appropriately rich and complex. It led to a concept of a constellation of interconnecting rooms of different shapes, where there was no dominant hierarchy, and the diagonal became an important spatial device. Two buildings are linked with a plinth at ground level, and the cellular and labyrinthine plan is intended to build in multiple thresholds to empower the owner, to stimulate and simulate the experience of a large house, the likely previous home of the new residents. It's like a city, a small city, with its paths and its constraints, with its social and private spaces. There is always the promise of something more just around the corner. Spaces unfold with a degree of anticipation. Rooms are perceptible as fragments. They remain hard to comprehend as a whole. And the plan is organised around an inner central room, a central room that both connects and separates. There are routes between and through. Bedrooms are treated as suites that offer alternative ways of use and occupation. This gives control back to the homeowner rather than the guest. It is a specific idea in response to a specific brief and targeted resident. And it's made possible by the open spatial structure of thin walls, a tolerant and resilient structure whose geometry is not found via a grid imposed upon the site, but one which responds to the urban footprint.
Ellis, I think you were in the audience of that 4-hour lecture by Peter Merkley. I knew there was a risk speaking third. I hope you're still with me. But before I start, the idea was that we would speak in a rather seamless manner. I just can't avoid miss the opportunity to say to so many people that I haven't seen for so long, I am so happy to be here. So with that said, I would like to continue where Stephen left off and really address more urban issues in our work. In the first instance, in relation to this project in Hampstead, while has already been stated, it is a project that is ambitious in plan, a constellation of rooms, but it is also formally bold, the way that it is arranged volumetrically. And in part, this derives from our readings of the older arts and crafts buildings that were built in this area of London, but also in relation to the mansion block as a building type that we have attempted to reinterpret in contemporary terms. These massing studies document a rather exhaustive, and this is only some of them, series of studies that were made The horizontal registers that we introduced were a device to reduce the scale of a building, particularly in relation to the neighboring buildings. In these recent photographs by David Grandorge, the photograph is finally finished. Yeah, and it holds a feeling of permanence, something that is a common interest in many of our housing projects, as well as the manner in which it's seeking a strong urban presence, and maybe even a certain timelessness. Our work and interests from the outset have addressed urban questions. These two early papers, A Way to Work and A View of How Things are papers that imply that it is necessary to draw upon things that exist and act in relation to the lessons that cities hold. To learn from looking and interpreting later in a critical manner. Our earlier projects were small, discrete additions to urban and sometimes suburban places. Shepherdess Walk, Coat Street, Wandsworth Workshops. Projects that have already been referred to, that all add to the city at a small to medium scale, but with a great intensity. To say that we're most at home working in the widest understanding of a European city must also take account of the diversity and complexity of these conditions and situations. Invariably, the tasks that we find ourselves addressing lie at the margins of cities, of places that house large, relatively new building types, where there is a need to reconcile the impact of transport infrastructure with the associated noise issues, brownfield sites, the need to repurpose older industrial buildings. These parts of cities have a ubiquitous character. In the past, the planning and the building of these parts of cities was rather unstructured. The historical centre of cities remains important in terms of collective memory. It offers a shared image of city, but it is rarely the setting for contemporary work. And if we can agree that any city is a work in progress, an inevitable state of incompleteness, the historical centre of European cities is the most protected. And on occasion, this renders it to have the status of a living museum. To build here is wonderful, challenging, and so rare. A project that we won in competition in 2010 to remodel the centre of Mendrisio, a small city in Ticino in the south of Switzerland. Through the introduction of a new public building, the city library, and a piazza that we developed with East, and further measures to improve the wider situation that we continue to be involved in. Our project here in Geneva lies near the historical centre of this city. It has resulted in a new corner building accommodating community and housing uses. It was undertaken with the Geneva architect Jean-Paul Jacot. The building consciously seeks a form of reconciliation between the two neighbouring buildings, a 19th century school that you can see on the left of the screen, and an office and commercial building from the 1960s that appears on the right. Here, a project in Munich for Eurobolden, where we're adding to and adjusting an existing triangular urban block. This is a project that, like many others, is exploring clear housing solutions to the contemporary imperative of urban densification. And the image of the facades can be seen to be respectful of older traditions of building that are encountered, while at the same time seeking contemporality. It was recently pointed out to me by Tony Fretton, who I hope is in the audience, that every city through its history has its own relationship to modernity. At every moment in time, a city is a modern version of itself. Conservation and heritage are, after all, relatively recent disciplines. With the recent death of Richard Rogers, we are reminded of his position, which supported the ambition that we had to contribute to this city and its rebuilding. At the time, he headed the Architecture and Urbanism department. Later, it became Design for London. He rather characteristically surrounded himself with younger, talented people who were our contemporaries, who in turn invited us to work on projects that were at a large urban scale, mostly in the East, and very often in collaboration with East. This seemed like an exciting moment for London, a city that was preparing for the Olympics in 2012 and remodeling its future role as a world city. Our project here, again in Munich, is drawing upon our experience of working in continental Europe, and it exposes us to another form of urban governance where every site has a defined set of limits that have come from democratic forms of agreement and the huge investment that this entails. This project is, in the first instance, a strategy plan for a 57-hectare site, and it will, in time, offer homes for 25,000 people and places of employment for 7,500 people. It is arranged around a series of loose-fit perimeter blocks. And it is rather like the urban projects of Heinrich Tessenow, who offers a somewhat picturesque urban model. Every parcel of land in Switzerland has a precise set of urban rules that must be respected. This makes development clearer and less speculative. These photographs document over time, and they are taken always from the same place, a process of change. The building profiles that you can see in the image on the top right represent a very Swiss way of informing the general public about the scale of a project that is in the process of being assessed by the planning department. They are what are called in German Bauprofile. It is also possible on larger projects to undertake revisions to the urban codes, but this involves a lengthy democratic process. Our work in the town of Arbonne, which lies to the east of Switzerland, is an example of this possibility. Here we're working on a project to create a new urban block that is denser and a bit taller than the existing rules allow for currently on this site. The building is arranged on the ground floor with a shopping mall. On the first floor, it supports employment uses, the plan on the left, which are arranged around a courtyard, and from the first floor upwards, residential uses on the corners. The facades indicate the scale of the building in relation to the neighboring buildings. This image shows an apartment and the wonderful views that are offered to Lake Constance and the distant mountains. Teaching has always occupied a considerable amount of our time. Since 2008, I have been a full professor in Mendrisio in Switzerland, and in 2019, I founded a new institute in our faculty, the Institute of Urban and Landscape Studies, for which I am the director. The focus of our teaching, it should be added, Stephen is a professor of housing and urbanism, and my own interest in teaching often draw upon housing and urban questions. This slide is a catalogue of the tasks that I've undertaken in this period as a teacher in Mendrisio. Between 2017 and 2020, over the course of 6 semesters, my teaching studio in Mendrisio pursued systematically the task of creating an urban plan for Zurich. In 20 years, the city anticipates a 25% increase in population. That means 100,000 people will need to be housed. Following a recent national referendum, Swiss cities are no longer allowed to spread indefinitely into the surrounding lands. They are compelled by law to remain within their existing municipal and territorial limits, and therefore become more compact and denser. This is to safeguard land in order to support agriculture, forestry, and a general sense of amenity. The recently approved Richtplan, which is the basis for the future planning of Zurich, is a policy document that frames and conditions the research that we undertook and are undertaking. Initially, over the course of 6 semesters, we undertook a program where we looked at every single area of the city and considered the manner in which its expansion, or yes, its densification, could be arranged. I realize now this was in total something like 120,000 hours of work, and I think some of the protagonists of this work are in the audience. I hope you are. Students' work was structured around 6 strategies that considered questions like heritage, movement, public realm, public building, buildings relating to employment and housing. But the students also undertook surveys of existing buildings as a study of building patrimony, as a way of informing them of the architectural character that exists so strongly in this city. In 2021, we secured a Swiss National Science Fund project, which I'm currently working on with Professor Tom Avermatte, and I'm going rather quickly through some of the work that was undertaken previously by the students. With Tom Avermatte, who's the chair of the History and Theory of Urbanism at ETH, working also with Irina Davidovich, who's the director of the GTA archive, and my own institute. And we're also working with 2 PhD students and a postdoc position. This image shows the current condition of Zurich. And this is our vision for how it will appear in 2040, with the projects of many of my students inserted. The point being made here is the city will retain many of the qualities that it will hold today. This is our advocacy, before and after. Adding to and adjusting the space between. While the buildings that we have built or are currently working on are invariably adding to an existing place, they are always informed by the readings that we make of place. Urbanism can be defined as a moment when something is added and can be seen in relation to something that already exists or anticipates a future relationship. This photograph by Thomas Struth offers an image of urbanity that I find very instructive, the sense in which a city can be made by one building being added in relation to ones that preceded it, but in a manner that is respectful and typologically similar. Okay, a less glorified setting than Rome, but our project on Seven Sisters Road arranged 3 new buildings that are rather, could be described as urban villas. They establish a clear interdependence to each other, as well as accuracy in terms of the relationship that they hold to the neighboring buildings. It is a project that at the time was described, and here I think I'm referring to Kieran Long's article in the AJ, as tough and scary. It impressed us at the time that such emotive words would be used. I feel that now one encounters buildings in this city and Europe more widely that have certain characteristics to this earlier project. Our work in Vienna was a collaboration between 3 offices, Werner Noeth, a Viennese architect, von Barmuskrucke, and our office. And we agreed, when working on this project, at the first meeting, a set of guidelines that each studio would explore. The result is an urban addition to the city which celebrates proximity and difference and sameness in equal measure, placing entrances towards the inside, not the outside. Each building would have 2 facets to the otherwise orthogonal form, amongst other rules that we imposed upon our work. This project in Zurich, the space between is measured in terms of the scale of the courtyard and the manner in which its perimeter is adjusted to sit within this part of the city, absorbing the geometry of the perimeter. It's a reoccurring interest also, this theme of corners and lessons from older precedents. An interest in type and and urban morphology always conditions our work. An example can be seen here in terms of the space between new housing buildings on a beautiful site on Lake Constance. While this competition was not successful, the knowledge we acquired helped us with the project that I showed earlier, the new urban block in the same city. But also many of the themes that were developed in plan helped inform the more recently completed housing project in Seebach, a suburb of Zurich. The site for this project lies near the limits of the city. 2 clients worked collaboratively, inviting solutions for their sites as one bigger overall site. And this allowed for a level of density because in normal terms, you have to respect a 5-meter distance between properties. The 2 buildings further explored this notion of the space between, what the Smithsons referred to as the charged void. Each building has small differences in specification, but the details and the expression is the same. Vertically arranged brick slips, precast concrete elements, corner balconies which break the largely orthogonal geometry of the plans, and a reduced attic which stems from the possibilities that exist within the building law. This project sits within a landscape designed by Müller-Ilien. The theme of in-betweenness is also employed in the interior planning, where a combination of orthogonal secondary rooms and looser representational spaces are arranged. Landscape settlement strategies. Ellis, I'm a little bit worried that you've invited East to give a lecture next in this series, because I feel like I've purged all of your projects. Please forgive me, Dan, Judith, and Julian. An interest in working at a much larger scale, a more strategic scale, has already been acknowledged. It's an interest that we've always had. Working in collaboration with East, we developed as a competition entry a project to extend the Kent town of Sittingbourne. It proposed within a polder landscape a network of bunds that we encountered when we first made a site visit there. Our project revolved around these as a service landscape, a landscape infrastructure rather than ideas for housing that would be built there in time. It is a project that is indebted to Florin Bagel and Phil Christo and the Architectural Research Lab, but also Alvaro Caesar's work in Evero that I will return to in a moment. When we were working on the project in Stevenage, which is more explicitly about type, a revision to the semi-detached house, of which 3 million were built in the 1920s and 30s. It was, at the time, more or less the suburban housing solution in the UK. In working on this project, we were also interested in how a revision of this housing type could create a new settlement. The double house as a type continues to interest us. Here, a more recently undertaken competition in Dietikon near, near Zurich. Reference has already been made to our collaborative working with Mark Horn and Crispin Kelly, and here with Crispin Kelly, a project that we completed a few years ago in Aldershot. The project was driven by a shared critical relationship to much volume house building that we see in the UK, and a search for alternative housing solutions. And again, referring to Tessenhoff, we're reminded of the possibility in his work of making a house that is house-like. And in the work of Eric Lyons and the span housing, the notion of homes within a garden. So with this project in Aldershot, there was a search in making a new settlement, places where soft landscaping is given priority over the impact of space for the motor car. Here we created unbound surfaces and a home zone, and it is really quite unlike most new housing estates where the car is seen to dominate. And finally, this project, which is a long way from Hampshire, a project that we've also been working on for a very long time. There's a wonderful slowness to building in Portugal. Working with the discipline of a master plan created by the Lisbon office of Promontorio, a landscape designed by João Nunes, we were invited to design only 10 houses as one of a number of clusters, along with Carrillo de Gracia, José Paulo dos Santos, Peter Merkley, and Promontorio. And in working in Alentejo, we naturally turned as a shared point of common interest to the work of Alvaro Siza and this masterful settlement that he planned for the expansion of Évora, but also the Carlos Siza house that Alvaro Siza designed in the 1970s, with a patio that is so wonderful in terms of manipulating geometry and was a very instructive reference in terms of creating a house with an outside space at its core. So in our work, we developed 3 house plans that are being built really very slowly and will, we hope in time, complete this cluster of 10. That was a dark thought. And finally, my father always said in a lecture, always say, and finally, often, because it gives the audience hope. But really some last words. We state that it is important to uphold an architecture that is responsible, that as architects, we're interested in the responsibilities demanded of architecture. But what do we mean by this? That our work and architecture in general has a social and societal function and should seek a humanistic character. That we employ construction in a sustainable manner, and in the making of buildings, this should be resilient and conditioned by their means. That we work with a relationship to the culture of architecture and its own logics and discipline. It is in relation to these parameters, we would argue, architectural experimentation should occur. Thank you.